raise a glass to the past and the ladies cross the ages, fallen fathers from the motherland whose lives are on the pages. And the barber said it best when he told us all the world's a stage. So fellas, grab a glass and lift your spirits to the seventh age.
Welcome, one and all, to the Seven Ages Audio Journal. It's time once again to pour up a glass and pull up a chair as we gather together here in our very favorite corner of the Crosstime Pub, continuing our quest in pursuit of understanding the ancient mysteries of the Americas and, as always, unraveling the historic lineage of humankind at archaeological sites worldwide. It's our pleasure to be here. I am Micah Hanks, and joining me are my cohorts, the Seven Ages Research Associates, two fine fellows, and a couple of rather spooky-looking individuals, considering the season, James Waldo and Jason Pentrail. Jason, I know you made your way up here into the mountains in recent days.
Yeah, we sure did, and I appreciate the compliment. I haven't been called spooky in quite some time, but 'tis the season, is it not?
It is indeed. James is always a little eerie, though, hiding out over there in his bunker.
Yeah, that's my trademark look. I look like you're not sure if I'm really mean or I'm just crazy.
Yeah, maybe just a little of both. But then again, aren't we all? You know, I had you guys on my mind in recent days because I've been doing a deep dive into some, ancient Egyptian history, one of my very favorite subjects. More on that in a moment, but another fond memory from the past, guys. It is the Halloween season, and one time, many moons ago, well, not that many moons ago, but we did do an official Halloween episode, and if you guys recall, that was all about cannibalism.
I do recall, as a matter of fact, and we hearkened back to some of those early American legends, if you will. That was one of our early shows. That was actually a lot of fun.
Well, I thought so too, and yet, it wasn't our most popular episode. I guess, people just couldn't really sink their teeth into that one for some reason. I don't know, maybe that one just didn't really bite on and take hold. I'm not really sure why, but I thought it was a great episode. Again, I mean, the historic archaeology side of things, when you can have, some historic records. Look at the guys laughing here. My dad jokes, are they too much for you?
Never too much. You can't beat a good dad joke.
Yeah, but no, I mean, some of these sites where we compare the known history of what happened in these American instances of frontier cannibalism with archaeology, where we're able to go there and perform excavations and find data, additional information that corroborates the historical accounts and sometimes even contradicts it. I mean, that stuff is fascinating to me. And of course, anthropologists have their own term for this, anthropophagy, that being the official scientific term for cannibalism. So if you go back in the back catalog, dear listeners, of course, you can find that Halloween episode, but this is officially our de facto 2022 Halloween episode. And I'll ask you guys, when it comes to those classic Universal horror films, what was your favorite?
Oh, Universal. Well, let's see. Wolfman's always right up there. Creature from the Black Lagoon was always good. That particular film was kind of on the forefront of costuming at the time, so it also puts you in mind of, cryptids and other things like that, because the costume I thought was pretty good in that one. But as you all know, and Mike, I know you're a big fan of these as well, Universal was okay, but I am a Hammer Films guy. They made the absolute best movies. If you've never seen Hammer Films, they're out of the UK, and all of their movies are classics, including one of my favorites, Captain Kronos.
Oh, yeah. That's a classic.
Yeah. Well, I have to go with something a little edgier, and what I consider to be the scariest movie ever made. And that's The Exorcist.
Oh, yeah.
That movie, if you didn't see that movie when it came out, and at the time, it was completely terrifying. And I didn't see it in the movies because, my parents would have, well, I take that back. My mom might have took me to see that. But it came on network television. I think it was on CBS. It was so scary that every time even the slightest scary scene happened, I would have to change the channel immediately because it just caused neural overload. It was just too much for my kid brain,
Oh, yeah. No, I know what you mean. I'd never seen that film, and I guess I was in my late teens or early 20s. I was driving at the time, and often so I could have a quiet place to study, I would drive over to the church where my father was the pastor. My dad's now a retired Episcopal priest, And so at the time, I would drive over there to the Church of the Redeemer, where there was an office next to the church. And I would sit there and I would do my homework. You know, I was a budding young aspiring writer, and I would stay up. I was a night owl. I'd stay up really late and I would write. And so I thought one night, you know, I've never watched The Exorcist. I guess I'll watch it here in the office next to a church. It was quite an experience, to say the least. But, you know, the interesting thing about all these films is that I could find a bit of an archaeological tie-in. You know, with The Exorcist, of course, we have that depiction of the god Pazuzu, right? This demonic presence in the film, but really an ancient god of fertility and the winds and things like this. And, you know, again, that representation featured in that film, one that's actually recovered through archaeology. Even with Creature from the Black Lagoon, I'm reminded of the Osceola River and some of those locations down there very close to, if memory serves, where they actually filmed Creature from the Black Lagoon. But I mean, we go into those you know, ancient water holes, and we still find the remains of monsters. Now, granted, these are the fossil remains of Pleistocene megafauna, but I mean, that to me is maybe the closest to there being a actual real-life corollary for what appears in that film. But whether it's those great Hammer films you're talking about, Jason, and I agree, I love those too, or it's the classic Universal representations, one of my all-time favorites, guys, was The Mummy. And I guess, you know, as a matter of it being classic, I'd have to go with Universal and Boris Karloff's famous portrayal in that film. But, you know, The Mummy was always fascinating to me because here was this, you know, fictionalized representation of something very real. Howard Carter going into a tomb and discovering all these riches, but also, you know, a sarcophagus, you know, that is containing the body of a long-dead pharaoh. That, to me, as a child, it just fascinated me, and I think that really, in a lot of ways, inspired my ongoing interest in ancient Egypt. And in recent days, I've been taking the deep dive down the question of the pyramids, the biggest remaining question of many about these ancient monuments really being, how in the heck were these things built? And you know, on my other podcast a while back, I did an episode where I kind of explored some of the possibilities, and I've always been fascinated by the historical account provided to us by the first historian, although his manner of record-keeping, as far as history goes, is quite different from what we do today in the scholarly sense of things. But yes, I'm talking about Herodotus, and when Herodotus travels to Egypt, and he goes to the pyramids and various other sites with the tour guides that would often take visitors from Greece or wherever around, you know, they tell him those monuments were built using machinery. There was a special kind of a machine that they used that would help them lift these blocks. And I think a lot of historians over the years have kind of thought, well, you know, we can't believe that much more than anything else we believe in what Herodotus tells us. Again, obviously, a lot of what Herodotus wrote was accurate. And then there's this blending of mythology and folklore that you find in there as well. And it really just has to do, I think, with, you know, separating those two. The folklore, which is pretty obvious, you know, men riding dolphins for, you know, hundreds of miles and things like this, you know, dog-faced humanoids and all these kind of things. But, you know, the account of the Herodotus machine, as it is therefore known, the idea that there was some sort of machinery that was used to assist in the construction of the pyramids, that's always captivated me. And even some archaeologists like Mark Lehner have proposed that perhaps machinery paired with a kind of ramp, you know, could have actually conceivably been used in the construction of those monuments. The ramp, that's another thing too, because I think there are a lot of misconceptions about how a ramp would be used to build the pyramids. And I've often thought about this too. In fact, James, I seem to recall you and I talking about this. If we were to use an earthen ramp to literally move these blocks all the way up to the top, especially during the final stages of construction of, for instance, Khufu's pyramid, I mean, there would probably have to be archaeological evidence of the materials that were used to build the ramp, which in itself would be an engineering feat, right?
It could be, but, you know, if you're going to have the finished product afterwards, you're probably going to go to at least some pretty far lengths to erase all of the things that you use to help you build the structure, because you just want the structure, you know, for its visual appeal, appearance there, because that was kind of the point of that thing, I think.
Oh yeah, well certainly. But now something that I guess is less often said, I hear people say this all the time. The idea of a ramp being used in the construction of the pyramids is pretty discredited. Yeah, maybe, according to who you're talking to, if we're talking about a single ramp that's built from earth that goes in one long sloping, path to the top of the pyramid at any, stage in its construction. But if you think about a ramp that actually is incorporated partly into the structure itself, and maybe that also goes up the side like switchbacks going up the side of a mountain, and that's something that would be a whole lot more feasible in my mind.
Yeah. So here's the way I look at it. And instead of trying to, back engineer how they actually built the pyramids, I think where I'm happy at right now with this is obviously the pyramids are amazing structures, and the engineering skills of those who designed and built the pyramids, world class even today. Right. And I would suspect that their engineering solutions that they produced to build this monument were probably as equally impressive as the monument itself.
They'd have to be, there's just no way around that. There's also no escaping the fact that the pyramids are a marvel. But what's really fascinating to me about understanding the way that the pyramids were built is going back to the very earliest structures. We have Djoser's pyramid, that step pyramid that was designed by Imhotep. And then as time passes, you have slightly more refined attempts and approaches where, for instance, you have the pyramid at Meidum and then the so-called bent pyramid. This one's really interesting because it's literally seemingly representative of a pyramid that begins being built at one angle and then abruptly in mid-construction changes. And not only the angle toward the actual apex of the pyramid, but also the ways that the stones were laid. Now, there were theories about this. I remember L. Sprague de Camp talking about how this may have had to do with the death of a pharaoh. It might have had to do with an ideological change. I think that the best explanation that we now have is that there was a catastrophic failure with the pyramid at Meidum, and in order to prevent a similar structural failure with the so-called bent pyramid, they changed this construction method in mid-step, so to speak. That is probably the best account for what's going on there. And then when you get over to the red pyramid, which curiously some of the Egyptians also know as the Bat pyramid, but the red pyramid, which actually was white in antiquity, it is more in keeping with the style of structure that we now recognize at the Giza necropolis. So it's just fascinating trying to unravel not only how it was all done and why it was done, but what the pyramids meant to the builders. But again, as a kid watching these horror films and watching The Mummy, it kind of planted that seed for a future interest in archaeology. And speaking of the future interest in archaeology, especially as it relates to Egypt, I do want to clue the listeners in that in the weeks ahead, we've got an astounding interview forthcoming with Bob Breyer. You want to hear all about this. And of course, this guy being one of the most authoritative experts on Tutankhamun. We'll be discovering the 100th anniversary of the discovery of his tomb. Definitely don't miss that. Frankly, we don't talk about Egyptology enough on this podcast, but that because of all the other cool things we get to talk about. And, on the subject of pyramids, this episode will actually be continuing our discussion of America's pyramids, or at least their closest corollary with the continuation of our Mound Builders series. And Jason, which mounds are we going to be visiting in this installment?
This time we'll find ourselves in Moundville, Alabama, something that we've had the opportunity to see collectively in the past, and we were able to return there with some great guests. We'll be talking with Dr. Elliot Blair tonight, as well as the Outreach and Education Coordinator, Lindsay Gordon. They both set aside time for us, sit down and give us a good interview and a good overview of this incredible site. So again, you can find all the photographs and pictures on Instagram, Facebook, and all of our other social media accounts. This was the last stop on our spring tour. We also have since then been able to add an additional location to the Mound Builder series, and we'll be bringing that in the coming year. But nonetheless, Moundville is always a beautiful place to go, and we consider it one of our homes now that we've been there a couple of times. And I encourage everyone, as we always do, get out there and see these sites, because again, I have met so many people that live literally 20, 30 miles from Moundville and their whole life and never actually been to the site.
That's an important point right there, Jason. And Moundville, by the way, in Alabama, not to be confused with Mound City up in Ohio, where we also had the pleasure of being able to visit a few years back. But I recently gave a short presentation at a Masonic lodge here in Asheville, all about mound sites and Southeastern archaeology. And we were talking, really just Eastern archaeology. I don't think you could call Chillicothe, Ohio, the Southeast, but I talked a little bit about the Mound City complex up there and the fact that at that location, as we found, you had these strange circular structures with squares within them that fit within the perimeter of those circles. And this, idea of the squaring of the circle, this really seemed to resonate with our Freemasonic brethren, and it's always great to share some of the work of the Seven Ages research team with people who are interested in archaeology. And again, this was a very important point that I also emphasized during that little talk, Jason. A lot of people, they see these mound sites and they think, is that a golf course over there? And they never even bother to go look. So we encourage people, get out there, learn about archaeology in your area, and learn about the past. And another way you can learn about the past, in fact, one of the best places to go and learn about history and maybe bring a little of that history home with you, is the Smoky Mountain Relic Room over in Sevierville, Tennessee, where our dear pal Chase Pipes is, of course, the curator and also one of the most energetic and enjoyable friends of ours who accompanies us out on our trips from time to time. What's cooking over there at the Smoky Mountain Relic Room right now, Jason?
Well, as we mentioned on the last episode, he is recently back from the Denver Fossil and Mineral Show, where he was able to get many more things to restock the shelves there at the Relic Room for the holiday season, as he always does. If you want something really, really unique, such as, say, a Spinosaurus tooth, well, they just got a huge shipment of Spinosaurus teeth. As a matter of fact, when I was in the shop just a few weeks ago, I was able to buy my oldest son his very first dinosaur fossil, and it is a beautiful Spinosaurus tooth, comes in a case with all the information about the species. When they do things over there at the Relic Room, they don't just hand out things. Chase goes to a lot of effort to make sure that the story goes along with the artifact. So not only is it something great to look at, but you also get the information so that you are actually learning about the species that you've purchased and all the things that go along with it. So it's great to have those type of things there at the shop. And there's many, many things that we haven't even seen before. We've got new minerals, we've got new metaphysical stones, and all sorts of things that are there in the shop, brand new, a lot of them for the first time. So head on over there. The holidays are certainly coming. And if you want something unique, you will find nothing more special than something from the Smoky Mountain Relic Room. Now, in addition, the new episodes are out. They got new episodes on YouTube. And the most recent one is featuring a local historian there in Tennessee, Roger Stinson, and they talk about the Battle of Dandridge, Tennessee. And the point of this is not only to educate, but also to show everybody that history can be found in your own backyard. And then over on the podcast, we have new episodes from the Denver Fossil and Mineral Show. We also have a great episode on the secret city of World War II. Can either of you guess what that might be referring to?
The secret city of World War II. I'm drawing a blank.
I know what it is.
What do you think, James?
Oak Ridge, Tennessee.
You got it. 100%. Oak Ridge, Tennessee. And then he also has a really interesting new episode on the history of transportation. So again, Chase knows no limits to his love of history, all types of history from every conceivable time period. And of course, he's trying to represent as much of that there in the shop at the Smoky Mountain Relic Room, the largest diversity of history for sale in North America.
Fantastic. Always great to hear from those guys. And on the subject of all those great podcasts, ladies and gentlemen at home, don't forget about what Jason's been cooking up for us over there on our Patreon for 7 Ages.
Absolutely. So Patreon is continuing to grow. I'm very excited about everything that's going on over there. I just want to take a second to thank everyone who has joined us to this point over on Patreon, showing your support for what we do here. It really means a lot to us. It allows us to get out there and get more content for you, to get out there on the road and do what we do best, 7 Ages audio journal out there on the road. But certainly it means a lot to have the support of all our listeners. And we encourage you, if you're still interested or on the fence about it, come on over and join us. Again, we have brand new podcasts. We have a new book club coming in November where all of our listeners there on Patreon will be able to join us to discuss the book that we have picked for that particular episode. We're going to turn those into podcasts as well so that other people can follow along with what we are reading and keeping up with. So we've got lots of exciting things. We've got the Digging Deeper podcast that you get over there as well. Those are extended interviews with special guests where we don't have a time limit and we just cover everything that we want to talk about until we have covered it all. And of course, you get the Cross Time Pub. That is the main podcast over there where we keep you up to date on all the news in history and archaeology, as well as special guests, some that you're familiar with and some brand new ones as well. We're also able to kind of stretch our legs over there and give you some more content with a wider range of subjects. So head on over to Patreon. You can just type in 7 Ages Podcast. It'll come right up. And again, we appreciate all of the support. We have 3 tiers over there on Patreon. So again, we encourage everybody to join us there and continue the conversation.
Indeed. Excellent work you're always doing over there, Jason. Excellent work in general. And of course, with all of us in different parts of the country and going in different directions at various times, it's integral that with our collective efforts, we're able to keep the 7 Ages research effort ongoing. And I actually hope in the years ahead, as perhaps maybe I'm able to whittle back on some of my tasks and things, that I can get back out there on the road. I really miss those road trips. I miss the participation on the archaeology sites and things like that. And even just over the last few days, making a little time to be able to dig deep, as we often like to do, dig deeper, in fact, and go into the history of ancient Egypt and the cosmology of the ancient Egyptians. It just reminds me how beautiful the history of this planet is, and of course, how fun it is to learn about our ancient human heritage. And so with that, it's about time for us to head south as we wrap up this Mound Builders series, for now at least, as we head to Moundville, Alabama, right here on the 7 Ages Audio Journal.
7 Ages Audio Journal and Chasing History on the road. Yet again, we have made our way across the country, down and back here to Moundville, Alabama. It is a true pleasure to be here again. We were here about 4 years ago. This particular site really made an impact on me, a huge impression, and that's why I wanted to wrap the show up here. It is an absolutely incredibly beautiful site, and one that is so well taken care of by the University of Alabama and all of the associated folks and volunteers out here that do such a great job. It is a true pleasure to be here. We are joined by Chase Pipes of Chasing History, who's been with us the whole time on this trip, doing the hard work out here, and we are happy to be here at Moundville. We are joined today by Dr. Elliot Blair from the Department of Anthropology at the University of Alabama. Dr. Blair is an anthropological archaeologist whose research focuses on the early colonial and late Mississippian periods in the American Southeast. Dr. Blair, thank you for joining us here on the 7 Ages Audio Journal.
Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I got to tell you, it's exciting. I've been looking forward to this all week. We spent the past week going through many different sites, and it's always great to see something you haven't seen before. But it was, in a way, a homecoming to be back here at Moundville. This is such a beautiful site, and as I mentioned, it is so well taken care of. And it's a pleasure to finally be speaking with somebody in an official capacity about all the wonderful things here at the site. So let's, introduce it to the listeners. If you're not familiar with Moundville, it is a prominent Mississippian site here in the Southeast with a lot of power, a lot of influence. So when was the site first established? And let's kind of move through the timeline of Moundville, Alabama.
Okay, so just before the Mississippian period began, there was a small woodland period occupation here on the terrace at Moundville. Then beginning around, about 1100 AD is when we had sort of the beginning of the Moundville I period and sort of the establishment of the site. And at the time, several small mounds are constructed, but it wasn't the, the stunning arrangement that we see right now.
Sure. Yeah. Meager beginnings. So do we have any idea what kind of kicked off that initial mound building phase?
That's a tricky question. When we talk now about, the Mississippian beginnings, a lot of people talk about the Cahokian Big Bang. And then Mississippianism sort of radiating out from Cahokia through pilgrimages, migrations, warfare, conquest, migrations, and that kicked off at Cahokia, and eventually spread here to Moundville.
Yeah, well, it's always interesting to see how something sort of rises up on the landscape. And what we do see here is a continued occupation over that time. But what was sort of, when do we get to the height of the site, if you will? When do we see sort of the centralized power and structure here at Moundville?
So that's going to be primarily in the 13th century, 1200 to 1300. We have the plaza periphery mounds built. These 29 mounds that built the site, but the ones that are circling this major plaza area, those go up at about 1200.
Yeah, great. So we're going to back up again here for a minute. Let's talk about, again, the location. So this is something that's always interesting. As we've been going across our tour here at all the various sites, we see a lot of commonalities with these sites. It makes sense. Big water source for moving goods, usually positioned high above a river. And that's exactly what we see here. So here in West Central Alabama, we are located on the convergent zone of two physiographic provinces. Tell us about the site and kind of how it works with those two provinces.
Yeah, so we're here on this major terrace over the Black Warrior, and so we're here at where the coastal plain, close to the Black Belt area.
Sure.
And so these the intersections of these areas, you have access to a wealth of resources when you're at the juncture of these different physiographic regions.
Sure. So, yeah, the positioning here is really interesting because you have the Cumberland Plateau, then you have the Gulf Coastal Plain, and it's positioned strategically to where it can exploit both of those types of food sources. So when we're looking at the food sources that help establish a site like this, what are we seeing from those two different provinces?
Well, the main thing here, of course, is, the agricultural productivity of the region and the ability to grow maize. And, that's just one of the hallmarks of the Mississippian period. And, that ability to grow, surplus maize. And right here on the Black Warrior, a fertile valley for maize agriculture.
Yeah, and then of course, we would have had deer, bear, turkey, all of those types of meat sources as well. Also, nuts, berries, those type of gathering type of things that we would normally see. Now, you mentioned the agriculture and it being here. What do we attribute that to? You mentioned the Black Belt.
Yeah, those are, incredibly fertile soils, wonderful for agriculture, and, these river terraces on the Black Warrior Valley, it's not the Black Belt itself, but it's still, wonderfully fertile soils.
That's just a natural process? That's not anything that they did to sort of create that environment? It's not man-made?
It's primarily natural, but, they certainly did engage in, human activities to,
sure.
To increase the fertility of soils.
Yeah, for sure. And so we see the implementation of the corn, but then we also see things like beans and squash, those type of things being grown as well. So once we see that get established, how does that affect the population here at Moundville?
Well, it goes from, this very small, woodland period population where it's, small scale horticulture. And then, the population just explodes during the Mississippian period as as Moundville was established as a major center.
What do we have for population estimates?
I think the most common estimate thrown around now is about 5,000, but it could have been much larger.
Yeah, I know it's hard to determine those things, but yeah, I think that's probably a safe assumption. Now, another unique feature to the location is the bluff top setting. So we have the Black Warrior River back here, a beautiful river, but we're pretty high above that. So how high is this bluff off of the Black Warrior River?
I'm not sure the exact,
but it's fairly significant, right? 50 feet or so.
Yeah, and what's so significant about it, of course, is that the site is safe from flooding.
Yes. Yeah, great point. So all of these things collectively, provide us with a great safe place. We're out of the flood zone, but yet we have access to that black belt. We have access to those fertile soils for growing those crops that are so important to developing a large scale central population like we see here. Now, when we get into the mounds themselves, there are a lot of mounds at this site. We've been to some where it's more of just a large central mound and then some satellite mounds around there, but everything's sort of consolidated to that center focus. Now here, we have a culmination of mounds, and it really strikes you when you come over those train tracks, like we discussed this morning. There's, that bump that you come over the train tracks, and then right in front of you is this beautiful complex laid out of all of these mounds, and it's very, very unique in the Mississippian world. So how many mounds are actually encompassed currently within the bounds of the park?
Our current total is 32, but you'll see many different numbers in the literature. It's a number that fluctuates. There's a number of smaller, minor mounds that sometimes aren't counted, documenting new ones that haven't been quite recognized. There are ones that have been recognized in the past, but have never been confirmed as actually being, man-made artificial constructions.
Sure.
So the number fluctuates, and we're finding new ones.
Well, speaking of the fluctuation of numbers, was this area ever agriculturally plowed?
Yes, it was heavily plowed, and including the tops of some of these mounds were plowed, and crops were grown on the summits.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Wow.
Yeah. This is unfortunately, it's a theme that we've seen repeated at every site that we've been to. That seems to have been the case. But nonetheless, what we have that remains here is still very, very impressive. And the main mounds that you see out there on the plaza are truly striking. Now, most of the mounds here are approximately, 12 to 15 feet in height?
Yeah, that's
Is that a good assumption? And then the largest mound here is more than 50 feet. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's 17 meters tall.
Okay, 17 meters. So what do we know about that tallest mound? Is that Mound A, the largest?
That one is Mound B.
Mound B.
Yes.
Okay, so many letters on so many mounds. So tell us about that. Let's start with the story of that largest mound. What do we know about it?
Actually, very, very little. There's been very limited archaeological work done on the mound. Part of that is just so large, it would be a daunting task to do excavations, flank trenches.
Sure.
A summit excavation could not penetrate very deeply into the mound, and even doing geophysical work on it, it's so steep and so tall, it's very, very challenging.
Is that mound thought to be the residence of the chief, or what do we know? Do we know anything, or is that all just speculation?
That's the assumption that it's it's often called the chieftain's mound, and until recently there was a reconstructed structure on the summit that was supposed to be sort of a replica of.
Okay, that's no longer there.
That's no longer there. That's been removed.
Okay, very good. So with that arrangement of the plaza, how does Mound B fit into the scheme of things? Is it facing a certain cardinal direction? Is it facing the east? What do we have there as far as astronomical alignments?
So almost all of the mounds in the plaza periphery grouping, they're almost all oriented on the cardinal directions.
Okay.
North, south, east, west.
That doesn't surprise me. Yes. Again, something we see very common in the Mississippian culture.
There is, of course, one major exception to that.
Yes. And that's where I was going to go. That's Mound A, correct?
Yes.
That's the one I was thinking of. What is it that's so strange about Mound A? How does it kind of throw everything off?
So Mound A is oriented towards the northeast. And so its corners are aligned in that sort of that north-south alignment rather than the faces of the mound. And it's also then, in the center of the plaza.
And so we don't have any idea what that was used for or why it's there?
It, again, is one that...
Another mystery.
Is a big mystery. These very large mounds here have had, very little work, and we know very little about them. Beyond a lot of speculation.
Just so we can kind of put it into our heads and get a visual for what the site looks like, can you give us a kind of a timeline of mound construction from, what were the first mounds that were built, and then that kind of an evolution, just so, the audience can picture it?
Sure. So the beginning in the Moundville 1 period, around 1100 or so, maybe a little bit earlier than that, we have two mounds that were initially constructed at the site, Mound X. And then there is a second mound. It's called variously the asphalt plant mound, or TU-50. And you can't actually see it from the site. It's off across Carthage Branch, the small creeks running along the side of the site. But it's within the vicinity here of Moundville, and that was one of the other two smaller mounds that was initially constructed.
Were they round mounds or platform mounds?
I've never actually been to the asphalt plant mound. It's not here on Moundville proper, and so I've never actually even seen that one in person. And Mound X no longer exists on the landscape. It was intentionally destroyed when the plaza periphery arrangement was constructed. And so the palisade that was constructed also after the mounds went up, it goes directly over top of where that mound was located.
Why is that? Do you see that on other Mississippian sites? An intentional destruction of a previous group's mound?
I'm hard pressed to think of, good examples that, that actually sort of echo, that story that we see here with Mound X. It's fairly unusual. I mean, it's not unusual to, intentionally burn or destroy buildings or, to rebuild, but to completely, wipe the mound, off the landscape, it was destroyed, and then, the plaza, the palisade went directly over top of it. Dr. John Blitz, did a lot of work at the mound, and he refers to it as this episode of selective forgetting. And it's a really interesting idea that when they remade the site with this this very striking plaza periphery arrangement, to intentionally destroy and remove this earlier mound.
Yeah, that is really interesting, and it puts me in mind of some of the earlier things we've seen on this trip, where there's a pre-Mississippian or woodland component to the mound building. Has any work been done on X that would indicate if it was actually a Mississippian era mound, or was it a woodland mound?
It was a Mississippian era mound.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. So that kind of clears that up a little bit. Now, as we continue the discussion of some of the prominent mound features here at the site, the plaza has a lot of really interesting things, but around the plaza, there are pairs or grouped types of mounds. What do we know about that?
Yeah, so that's one of the really interesting things about this plaza periphery arrangement of mounds. So there's a number of really striking features that have been observed. One is that these mounds decrease in volume as you go from north to south. So the largest mounds, Mound B, are at the Mound E and Mound R are at the north end of the plaza, and then as you go to the south end, they decrease in volume. They're much smaller. And then symmetrically going around the mound, that you have these pairs that you mentioned. You have these very large platform mounds paired with somewhat smaller mounds.
Now that's very interesting. So north being the largest, south being decreasing in size. Is that indicative of any sort of astronomical influence, or does it appear to be an elite status, or do we even know?
There have been a number of hypotheses put forward about what this arrangement means, and one of the traditional interpretations, of course, was that you have the paramount chief living on Mound B, and then you have lesser chiefs as you go around the plaza to these smaller mounds. Dr. Jim Knight has had some alternative interpretations where he suggests that what we have here are clan groupings. And these are ranked clans, sort of reminiscent of what you see on square grounds in historic.
Right. Yeah, that's very interesting.
And so he sees a parallel there with the arrangements here. And so these paired mounds would be associated with distinct clans residing at the site and decreasing in ranking as you go around.
Well, that's very interesting. Does the archaeology seem to agree with any of those theories, meaning the larger mounds are producing a higher status type of burial good versus what we see in the smaller mounds, or has that been done?
It's hard to say that in terms of status. When he did his major mound study here, what he did find was that there did not seem to be particular specializations associated with individual mounds. They seem to be, treated as these, pairs that's, sort of replicated in some ways what was being done at the other mounds. Yeah. So not major evidence of status differentiation.
Wow. Yeah. It's fascinating though. And, it was obviously done for some apparent reason, but nonetheless, something for future study, to say the least. So moving along with our tour of the mounds here, we also have Mound C and D that are located away from the plaza to the north and to the east of Mound B. Both of those are burial mounds. Is that correct?
Yes. Those were excavated by C.B. Moore back in the early 20th century, and he excavated many burials. And these were some of the burials with the most, the richest, most elaborate funerary objects deposited with them.
Okay, so these would have essentially been maybe reserved for elite burials only?
Yeah, that's absolutely the thought.
Okay, well, that's very interesting. And so the location of those, again, as we're talking about this, I always encourage the listeners, pull up a map of the site, so you can follow along with us, because there's a lot of mounds here and it's really important to kind of see how they're labeled. So as we continue through the conversation, you can kind of follow along and look at some of these arrangements. But for C and D, how are they arranged on the property as far as chief in the plaza? How are they arranged?
So if you think about this where the plaza is sort of ringed by the plaza periphery mounds, you have B at the northern end, and then these mounds sort of ringing the plaza. C and D are located to the north of this this configuration, and sort of to the northeast and northwest of Mound B.
So that would be in keeping with it seeming like the elites are on the north end of the property.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so I think we're starting to see some clarification here. It's all coming together. So as we continue to look at that, now something that I think is unique about Moundville and the research I was doing versus some of the other sites that we've seen is most of the mounds here included structures. And what do we attribute that to? Because in a lot of the other sites, structures seem to be absent on top of the mound other than like a central temple.
Yeah, there's many mounds that had structures here, and it seems that there's a diversity of purposes, and that goes back to what you were mentioning about these pairings of mounds, the larger ones and then the smaller ones that are sort of oriented in pairs going around the circumference. The original hypothesis was that those smaller mounds were burial mounds. And the work that Dr. Jim Knight did back in the 90s and early 2000s, he showed that many of them aren't burial mounds as we might think of burial mounds, but they seem to be places where human remains were handled and processed, and funerary activities took place, but many of them weren't strictly burial mounds, but there were also structures on the summits, and for a variety of purposes.
Multi-purpose, right? And of course, we speak oftentimes about these mounds as if they were only used for one thing ever, but you got to remember that we're talking generations and generations of people over hundreds of years occupying these mounds. So of course, naturally, the use of those can change with seasons, with influence, with different leaders. And I think that's what makes a site like this so very interesting, because you have such a variety here of things that you don't necessarily see at other Mississippian centers. Now let's turn our attention a little bit to the plaza, because something that we've learned about the Mississippian and even woodland mound sites is that the plaza seems to be a center of activity. It's always very important to the site. It's a central location. And at every single site that we've been to thus far, there is the presence of leveling and building up of that plaza. Do we see the same thing here at Moundville?
Yes, we do. There's a lot of evidence that a tremendous amount of labor went into creating the plaza here. And I forget the exact, volume numbers. Dr. Cameron Lockman, also in the Department of Anthropology here in Alabama, he's done a lot of work on the volumetrics of the mounds and the plaza. And it seems like it may have been more work to construct that plaza than to build the mounds.
I believe this one is like over 70 acres, I believe, right? 74 acres.
Enormous.
Yeah. So yet again, another enormous plaza. And while we have talked about the construction of the plaza at some of our other sites on this tour, we really haven't talked about what happens on the plaza. So is there any archaeology here at Moundville that is indicative of what activities were happening there, or anything? I know they're generally kind of sterile, but is there anything that you know from the archaeology about the plazas?
Well, understanding of the plaza has sort of radically changed in the last 10 years. About 10 years ago, maybe a little longer, Dr. John Blitz and Chet Walker did a large-scale magnetometry survey of the site. And then following up on that, Dr. Jared Davis did her dissertation testing a number of the features that they identified during that magnetometry survey. And one of the things they found was there were many, many structures, particularly early structures, that seemed to have been present on the plaza, which then later removed, the plaza created, and it then became more of the sort of the open area that we might think of as traditionally think of as a plaza.
Sure. So there's an evolution there of use.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Very interesting. Now, let's pick the conversation up there, because I understand those buildings that you mentioned. I can't think right now of any other plaza that I've seen or we've discussed that had the presence of buildings on it. So these were located, if I remember correctly, in the northeast and northwest corners of the plaza. And something unique about them is they're at ground level. Being on ground level versus up on a mound, would that indicate that they are for general use or public use or something that the average person could have accessed?
Well, I mean, ringing the plaza and, just inside, between the mounds and the plaza, there are, major sort of residential sectors here at the site. And so, these would have been where, many of the people just living here would have been residing.
Yeah, it's all very interesting to kind of envision it around the plaza, that center of the heart of the site. So other features that we have here is the borrow pits. So that's always a feature of Mississippian sites. And something I think that often gets overlooked is the borrow pit. So you're literally, digging the pit to build a mound or a structure. But I often wonder, being that they were left on the landscape, is there anything from the archaeological record that shows what the borrow pits may have been used for after? I mean, were they utilized in any way other than just being a hole in the ground?
So the borrow pits here are pretty interesting. Some of them, we think are original borrow pits. Some, they may have been enhanced or somewhat created by the Depression era restoration work that was done here at the park. For those though that, are original, they do find, fish hooks and artifacts and such. So, they would have been, ponds that could have been.
Yeah. And I've often thought, would they have brought fish from the river and put them in the ponds and created their own food source, kind of like people do today? It's a possibility. It just seems that because oftentimes we see the borrow pit left on the landscape, that it wasn't backfilled in any way. It seemed that it may have become an important feature to the overall plaza. And I was just wondering if the archaeology reflected that, but that's very interesting.
But it seems, it's not entirely clear how original those were. And so it seems like a lot of the earth that was used for the mound construction probably came from the ravines. And because there's certainly not the volume from the borrow pits that would be required to construct all the mounds.
Right. And being up on the bluff, you obviously have access to those ravines. Is there indication that those ravines would have been used for, something like depositing trash or debris from the site? Has there been any archaeology done in the ravines themselves?
Not much that I'm aware of.
Okay, yeah. Just a thought as it's leading down to the river. So moving along, let's talk about the research here at the site. So I understand that the first archaeological investigations by Clarence Bloomfield Moore, necessarily call those archaeological excavations, but we're talking 1906. So he was a Philadelphia lawyer, and he was kind of the first one to get in here and start exploring. What do we know about his impact on the site?
Well, he dug a lot. He spent at least two field seasons working here, and and if you read his journals, his publications, a lot of what he refers to, not so much at Moundville, but other places, he refers to what he does as demolishing mounds.
Oh wow!
And here, his extensive work, and he was searching for burials and, whole pots, incredible funerary objects. And so, he wasn't interested in the plaza, in the open space in the houses. He was digging mounds and looking.
And based off of his journals and the information provided, was there anything that he kind of spelled out about what he was finding so that you can kind of get an idea of how much was actually taken from the site?
Yeah, I mean, the artifacts that he recovered, a lot of those are, now at the National Museum of the American Indian. They have those collections, and yeah, I mean, he enumerated all the burials, all the artifacts that he thought were significant to document, and yeah, it's still one of the very largest archaeological projects that ever took place at Moundville.
Wow,
that he did.
Well, at the very least, at least there was some documentation that aids archaeology to some degree later on. So instead of just things are destroyed and gone missing, at least he left some sort of semblance of what he was taking. So I guess that's important. Now, over the next 2 decades, the site was looted, I understand, pretty extensively. Do we know to what degree, how many people, or what exactly was lost? What was the condition after those 2 decades?
Well, it was looted. It was heavily farmed. But, we don't have a great sense of what was lost. We do know then, that's once we get to, the 1930s, it took, massive efforts to restore many of the mounds. They were reconstructed, recontoured. Lots of fill was brought in to, make the site look more like what it would have looked like prior to that.
Sure.
Agriculture and the looting.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, talking about that sort of saving the site, around the mid-1920s, there was a strong effort here locally to save the site here at Moundville, headed by Dr. Walter Jones. So by 1933, the site had become officially known as Mound State Park. But what do we know about Walter Jones? What did that effort to save the site look like?
Well, he wanted to purchase the site so it could be owned by the state and protected. And so, he led that initiative, and then later the CCC came in and began the Depression era work to preserve it, to build the museum that's here, and build the mounds back up.
Sure. And the museum is named for him. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
So there again, we see the same sort of history being repeated at these sites as we go. There seems to be that destruction, rebuilding, and then establishment of the park. So as we move on, we get to a point to where we have a reestablished site in the 1930s. It's doing much better. It's getting funding. It's getting protection. And then it begins to grow into what we have here today. So I want to recap here for just a moment, because there's some important points to reach here. So the site reached its height in the middle Mississippian. So that's about 1200 to 1450. So that's in keeping with some of the other well-established sites that we've seen throughout the Southeast. Now, when we were discussing the site of Spiro, it was sort of given to us as a center of population. So we have Cahokia in the north. You have Spiro has a gateway to the west. You have Etowah in Georgia, kind of controlling some of that southeastern region. And then we have Moundville. So what was Moundville's influence from the center here? How far out was its influence in the region?
That's a very good question. I don't have a great answer for that.
It's hard to track.
Yeah.
But yeah, generally, we see the movement of artifacts to certain degrees, but the Mississippian world was so complex. But this was considered basically to be the capital of the Mississippian world for this region. Is that correct?
Yes, it's thought to be a capital, and and also a center where people from all over would come to meet. And that, going back to the plaza discussion, that very well may have been one of the purposes of the plaza, where people would come for gatherings, fairs, markets to congregate.
Do you see artistic work that's being created here at Moundville that is going out to other places? Do you find that artistic styles that's being produced here found, 100 miles away, 200 miles away, or influence?
Yeah, I mean, the long distance trade is one of the hallmarks of Mississippianism, and there's a number of artistic styles associated with Moundville. Particularly think of like the hemp hill engraved varieties, and these things were traded, and they are found throughout the Mississippian world.
What about materials coming into the site, as far as trade materials such as mica or different types of stone? How far is things traveling to this site?
Oh, I mean, certainly hundreds of miles. It's extensive trade. Copper's coming in here. You mentioned mica. All kinds of materials are flowing in and out. Certainly a hub of long distance trade. So on the Gulf Coast, shell, marine shell.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Yeah. Well, looking at those trade networks, they are truly extensive. We really got a lesson on that at Spiro of just how far some of these goods can travel. Truly fascinating. Now, something else that is kind of unique to Moundville that we don't necessarily always see is things were not always peaceful here, it would appear. There are the presence of stockades being erected, conflicts, I guess, with other chiefdoms in the area. What do we know about the violent side of Moundville?
Well, you mentioned the palisade that was surrounding the site, and that's a tremendous amount of labor to fell the trees and erect that. So certainly a defensive construction. And then again, some of the the bioarchaeological work that's been done here, there is lots of evidence of violence and trauma in the skeletal remains.
That was going to be my next question. Yeah. So, there was obviously something going on. Now, you may not know this because it's nuanced. It would be hard to tell. But are we looking at like Mississippi Valley chiefdoms that may have been in conflict with? Is there any type of weapon or projectile point that's kind of unique to Moundville versus that area that we see in those locations of skirmishes or battles or anything along those lines?
No, nothing really comes to mind here on that. I don't know that anybody really knows who they were
in conflict with.
And in the the projectile points here. It's the little Mississippian triangular points.
Pretty standard
and ubiquitous everywhere.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. Well, as we return to the site discussion of the culture, the techno-complex, the people that were living here, each site that we visited seems to have a calling card of something that they do very uniquely, whether it's copper work, whether it's the shell engraving works that we see at Spiro. Here, one of the famous calling cards is the Hemp Hill style pottery, which is absolutely beautiful and very unique to this site. And it's very high art. It's very complex and beautiful. So tell us about the process of that pottery and what makes it so distinct here at Moundville.
Sure. So, as you mentioned, it's very distinct, very beautiful. These like all the pottery here during the Mississippian period at Moundville, it's shell tempered, but it's usually very, very fine shell. And these are heavily burnished. So they're, you typically have this very sort of glossy finish to them. And then it's very, very fine in sizing, with, lots of, distinctive motifs. So it's very elaborate, very detailed work, very finely done.
And I will get into some of that iconography and those motifs here momentarily, but something that I was reading that seemed to be really unique to this site is that high art type of vessel was used by both the elite and the commoners. What kind of supports that evidence? Are we seeing it in all aspects of the site?
Yeah, it's found, throughout the site. It's found, the excavations, that you mentioned, C.B. Moore doing, some of the, the elite burials that he excavated in mountains C and D. You find those types of vessels. And then, throughout the roadway excavations that they did during the Depression, there's also, loaded with burials. And, these are individuals living in sort of the residential sectors away from the mounds.
Sure.
And these individuals also found with these same types of pottery.
And in addition to that pottery, there's some very striking items that come specifically from here, like the stone palettes and things like that. But the iconography here is also very impactful. So I think it's safe to say that probably one of the most known and recognized iconographic symbols from here is the eye in the hand motif. And now I understand we do see that a little bit at Spiro and here and there, Etowah and some other places, but it seems to kind of have its focus here. What do we know about that striking design?
Well, yeah, it's certainly sort of a hallmark of Moundville, and I'm not an iconographic specialist, but my understanding is this sort of thought is that portal, sort of axis mundi, kind of connecting
right.
Upper worlds, lower worlds.
Sure. I was reading a research paper one time that sort of referred to the eye as if it were the constellation of Orion, or sort of that gateway or portal in the Milky Way. Is there any way to sort of prove that or speculate about what it might have actually been indicative of through the archaeology?
I think we can do a lot of speculation. I'm not sure that we can prove that.
Sure. It makes sense. Well, again, the site here is absolutely phenomenal. Now, you talked about some of the motifs. Let's get into some of those, because these pots are often more than just a circular pot or a circular vessel. They have a lot of animal shapes and other shapes. So what's some of the most prominent motifs that we see here on the Hemp Hill style pottery?
Well, one of the examples that comes to mind, and you see it there hanging on the wall right there, the sort of the winged serpent is sort of a classic one that is found, on many examples of this Hemp Hill engraved pottery.
Sure. Yeah. And that's one throughout many ancient cultures. So that's very interesting. But they also did many other animals and things. So do we normally see it represented as just what they're seeing in nature, or are there more esoteric or enigmatic symbols put in there?
Yeah, I think many of these, and we see this, throughout the Mississippian world, we have sort of these sort of anomalous creatures that have, features that, blend sort of the air and the water and the earth.
Sure.
And, aren't strict representations of, precisely what we see in nature.
Sure. Yeah. And it's always fun to see their interpretations of those and sort of speculate about what they might have meant to the people here at Moundville so many years ago. As we move forward in the discussion, there's a lot of great things that are going on here today. So we've looked at the past. Let's learn a little bit about how you're involved with the site here today and some of the many things that are going on. So I understand that you still have field schools going on here, but you also have some basically restoration and rescue efforts in place. So how are you involved at the site?
So I came to the University of Alabama in 2015, and I was not doing archaeology at Moundville or in the Black Warrior Valley at that time. And a couple of years later, we for years, for decades, the University of Alabama has had a fall field school that is taught here at Moundville. And beginning in 2017, I was asked if I wanted to take over that field school and begin training students here and doing research. And I said, absolutely. I'd love to work at Moundville. And, so I was thinking about, what is the, what needs to be done? What would I want to do with that field school? And, the obvious answer was, we need to do something about the erosion that's happening here at the site. The river is severely impacting the site. I think the number is, 10 meters in the last 10 years that have been lost along the riverbank.
Wow.
And, this is something that, lots of people have recognized. And at that time that I was, starting up to do a field school, the university, the Army Corps of Engineers, and the Office of Archaeological Research were, working together to develop a plan to try to stabilize that riverbank. And so what I wanted to do was to use the field school to help out in that effort and do geophysics, shallow geophysical work along the riverbank to try to document what was being impacted, and then do small-scale excavations to test those geophysical features and also test in areas that were, going to be lost and eroded in the next couple of years.
Yeah,
and so we spent a couple of years doing that.
That's fantastic. So as you're doing the geophysical work, that's always a big interest of mine. What are we looking at? Is there a certain area that you're focusing on, and what are the results that you're getting? What type exactly are you using?
So right along the riverbank, we used ground penetrating radar. We did magnetic radiometry, and we did an electrical resistance survey. And this was a fairly small area. If you've been down to the riverbank area, it's pretty overgrown. It's heavily wooded. We had to do a little bit of clearing of underbrush to, and then there was a wooden boardwalk that runs through that part of the site. So we're sort of working around the boardwalk and the wooded area. But we were able to set up a couple of grids and do some geophysical work there right along the eroding area. And it's this really interesting spot because there are these two rises on either end of where we were working. And so we situated our grid right between them, and lots of features showing up in the geophysics, evidence of structures, evidence features that we still have no idea what they are. We haven't done the excavations to test them, but lots of activity happening there at the site.
Sure. Well, that's fantastic. It's always great to see an ongoing research, archaeology moving forward with modern technology. It's very exciting. As we look to the future of Moundville, what would you hope to see happen here in the next 5 to 10 years? Is there a certain area you want to focus on, or a certain type of information you'd like to gather? Where do you see the future of Moundville?
I think I make 2 or 3 points about that. One, I think, we certainly want to continue these non-invasive geophysical methods. I think that's, the future of archaeology. And
absolutely.
I think, particularly at a site like this that's protected and, cared for, it's not going to be destroyed by, human construction. So
sure.
Using these techniques, I think, is wonderful. And so I want to see more geophysical work, larger scale geophysical work. And then, excavation work that's targeted towards these portions of the site that are being lost, where erosion's happening. The ravines are a big problem. We're losing lots of the site into the ravines, into the river. So just sort of doing the mitigation work that's required to document that. The other thing I think we need to do a lot more in terms of collaboration with the native communities, the descendant peoples from Moundville. And, I'm sure, we're beginning discussions about, what field schools are going to look like going forward, how we can do those well, ethically, and in collaboration with native people. What kinds of questions are we as archaeologists interested in, and what kind of questions are the descendant communities interested in? And I think, all of these things together, geophysics, non-invasive techniques, preserving portions of the site that are in danger, and working with descendant communities. I think that's the future of archaeology at Moundville.
Well, that's certainly something to be commended, and we congratulate you here at Moundville. You guys are setting the template for many other sites, and we hope that many other historical, archaeological parks throughout the nation and the world will follow in those footsteps. Again, we are speaking with Dr. Elliot Blair, Department of Anthropology at the University of Alabama. Dr. Blair, it's been a pleasure having you here on the 7 Ages Audio Journal. Thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this.
Here at Moundville, they have a plethora of different programs and volunteer opportunities, lots of great things going on here at the site. I'm joined right now by Lindsay Gordon, who is the Education and Outreach Coordinator for the site. Now, this is a very special role, and you have all sorts of things that you're involved with. And we want to get into some of those details because here at Moundville, you have a lot more programs than some of the other places we've been, and I think it's really setting a template for moving forward with interpreting sites like this. So officially, welcome to the 7 Ages Audio Journal.
Well, thanks for having me, and welcome to the park.
Yeah, it's great. You know, we got to come here about 4 years ago. As I've mentioned, I'm going to keep harping on it. I really love this place. I think what you're doing here with interpretation and everyone who's involved, the site is just beautifully maintained and one of my very favorite places to come when we're out here on the road. So can't brag about Moundville enough. So what is your role here as the Education and Outreach Coordinator? What are you responsible for?
So it's a role that I very much cherish because I also act as a steward of the park, and I educate the public about the park and the people of descendant communities that call this place home as well.
Well, sure. So how do you go about doing that? What are some of the programs that you're involved with, and what can people expect when they come out?
So it includes a lot of collaboration. So we're in springtime now. So I'll start with our springtime events. Typically in March, we have our annual nap in. So you can come and hang out with us with some flint nappers and learn how to flint nap as well. Sure. And learn about the art of stone tool making from some people who have done it for a very long time.
It's a favorite pastime of mine. Great thing to learn.
The next event we typically have, it's actually coming up really soon, and it is our annual Bird Fest. So we have the Duck Bowl, and of course, birds are very sacred, and it's a great place to bird watch. The site is actually a part of the West Alabama Birding Trail, so we have a lot of birders come out, and we partner with like the Alabama Audubon and the Black Warrior River Keepers to talk about the natural history of the park and all of its resources.
It's an excellent sounding program. So we're here in springtime. You got a lot coming up, but throughout the year, you have all sorts of things going on. So one of the big things that you have here is your annual festival. Tell us about that.
Yes. So our annual festival will be in its, I think, 35th year this year. So it's a 4-day festival that happens the first full week of October, and it is a celebration of Southeastern culture. So everyone who calls this place home from all of our descendant communities come back home. There's dancing, we have a stage, there's our vendors, we have a living history area, we also have an education corner, and we are just happy to have everybody back. Please come and join us. If you're in the area, we would love to have you. We also basically see almost every 3rd and through 5th grader as well. So they come in and get some education at the park as well. That's a great thing to have. You know, it's so important to have those young students involved in taking ownership of a wonderful place like this here at Moundville. Now, you mentioned something there involved with the festival. You mentioned the descendant populations, and that's something that is so vitally important to interpreting these type of sites. And you guys have a fantastic program here at Moundville that involves descendant population. So tell us a little bit more about that, your field schools and everything else that they're involved with here at the site. Yeah, so typically, specifically for field schools and other things, we do consultation with the tribes. Typically started out with simple phone call. We'll call and ask for opinions often. And they come in and do demonstrations and things like that for us. For instance, when I know you guys were talking about the flying the winged serpent earlier, I actually heard a story from one of my Chickasaw friends that talked about how her grandfather had been telling her that story for a long time, and it being interpreted at the park was her first time of visually seeing it. Oh, wow. So the storytelling aspect of it is extremely important and helps us inform what's going on as well. And that's something that happens at festival and throughout the year as well. So tribal input is extremely important to us, and we get it as often as possible.
Yeah, that's absolutely wonderful. And again, setting a template for many other sites throughout the nation. Now, you have a University of Alabama special student group of indigenous students known as Bison. What can you tell me about them?
Yes, we're excited to be partnering with them. We are hoping that they get to expand more and become a safe place for at least the students of Alabama, the University of Alabama, to go from those descendant communities. They will be working with us on a couple of different projects. Actually, we'll be visiting with them next week. We'll be talking about the natural history of the site. And so they'll be talking about it from their indigenous perspectives, whether it be from the Muskogee perspective or a Choctaw perspective. So because there's a Muskogee student and a Choctaw student.
Sure.
And there's another student who's from a tribe in Oregon. So everybody gets to put in their input.
Oh, wow.
As well. So we're really excited for them to be starting that program there. We're also grateful for the Department of Equity and Inclusion that is on campus. They partner with us throughout the year to do exhibits and to help us celebrate Native American Heritage Month, which is in November. So,
all right, very good. Native American Heritage Month. Now, tell us a little bit more about that, because it's a big deal here at the site. So you do all of those things, but you have programs throughout the month. Is that correct?
Yes. So during Native American Heritage Month, we have our annual 5K. So that's you can come and run around the mounds with us, usually that first week of November. We also partner with the Astronomy Club, and we do they get to come out and stargaze, and we typically have a tribal member come out and tell a story along with viewing the stars for the night. We also partner with the Department of Equity and Inclusion and some other members from the descendant communities to create exhibits on campus. So we'll create a pop-up exhibit. Not sure what this year's will be, so be on the lookout for that. Last year was about movement. So Moundville was a big trade site. So we talked about the things that came and went from Moundville as well. And so we do lots of programming during that month.
Yeah, that's absolutely incredible. And again, so vitally important to interpreting these sites. And you know, what I think is really important, what you're doing here at Moundville, is you're, like you mentioned, a safe place for indigenous people, something that they can relate to, something that they can come out and take part in as a community, but also to practice their beliefs and their ceremonies. So I understand that the site is available to indigenous communities when they have a certain ceremony that they need to perform. Tell us a little bit more about how they're involved with the site in that way.
So we typically do, like with the Office of Archaeological Research, they have tribal consultation, and some tribes have tribal historic preservation officers. So with that, if they decide they would like to come to the site and do ceremony or things of that nature, they would just contact us or them, and we help them make arrangements. That's typically how that's been done. It's not generally open to the public.
Sure.
But that's usually through the tribe's offices.
Very good. And so as we came across the train tracks and see the beautiful mounds here today, we couldn't help but notice that the grass is a little bit taller than it normally is.
Yeah.
What do we have going on there?
So that is done on purpose right now. We want to see what native plants are actually growing so that we can go back and inform ourselves and the tribes of things that are growing. We actually also have our Three Sisters garden that we have a seed bank. So we basically trade seeds with the tribes, whether it's our purple and white corn or our different gourds. We try our best to send some seeds out and get some seeds back and grow them. Typically, if you come to festival, you'll see our full garden in bloom. And so you'll be able to visit us down there and learn more about some of the crops that were grown here in that way.
That's awesome. And then one more thing that I think is very unique about the site here involving the indigenous community is there is special attention given to things that happen in and around the park, fallen trees of cedar, sage, things like that. Tell us a little bit about how that works here at the park.
Well, I didn't mention our maintenance staff, but they're great. And they take great pride in the land as well as stewards. But they will, if there's a cedar tree, we know that our tribes, some find the cedar to be very sacred. So we actually keep the wood in case they might need it for ceremony or anything of that nature. So there are different aspects of the park that we will utilize for things like that.
Again, here at Moundville, they're really putting forth the effort to be inclusive of the indigenous community, as well as being an incredible interpretive center for everyone who wants to come learn about our earliest populations here in North America. Now, in addition to everything that you just discussed, you also have a YouTube channel and a donation, or a ability to donate. So let's talk about that for a minute. Donations are vital for places like this to be able to keep up everything that's involved. And when you come here, you will see this is one of the most premier and beautiful sites for Mississippian heritage in the United States. Trust me, we've been to almost all of them, and they're all very unique and very beautiful. But Moundville, for me, is sort of a crowning achievement of what can happen when everyone's working together. And I really commend you for everything that you're doing here. Those donations, again, are very, very important. You can find more information about that at moundville.museums.ua.edu. Go there, you're going to find a Get Involved button. Just click on that button and just follow the prompts through. And again, those donations are very much needed to save these sites, to maintain these sites. They've got erosion issues. They've got geophysical surveys going on. There's lots of things here that they need support for. So please help support these sites. YouTube.com/UA Museums. Go check out the YouTube channel, hit that subscribe button, and help them grow that channel. I want to thank you for your time today, Lindsay. It's been great talking to you and everybody here at the staff. I want to give a special thanks to the University of Alabama, everyone here at Moundville, Dr. Elliot Blair, of course, Lindsay Gordon here with us now, our Education Outreach Coordinator. On behalf of Chase Pipes, Micah Hanks, James Waldo, and our special guest and associate, Lash LaRoux, thank you all for joining us on this very special tour this year, our Spring 2022 tour of mound sites throughout the U.S. We've been to a lot: Pinson Mound, Shiloh Mound, Spiro, Poverty Point, and we wrapped it up here today at the beautiful and enigmatic Moundville, Alabama. Thank you all for joining us, and we will see you soon on the next edition of 7 Ages Audio Journal.
Another excellent addition with all the mound locations that we've visited. You know, every time we go, we learn something new. And many of those sites associated with the Mississippian cult, you know, the mound building cult, as some have referred to it, there's always something new to learn about it, something fascinating to learn. But, you know, there are other areas of interest that you can learn something new as well, and one of those happens to be the history of alcohol. Before we pony up and wet our whistles here at the Crosstime Pub, I want to share a couple of classic quotes with you guys. This one dates all the way back to 2200 BC and reads as following: "The mouth of a perfectly contented man is filled with beer." Now, this is no joke. This is actually, according to an ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic that appears to be one of the earliest references in all of history to beer. Here's another that details the instructions of Ani regarding his mother. "She sent you to school when you were ready to be taught writing, and she waited for you daily at home with bread and beer." Not bread and butter. The Egyptians knew what was up. Bread and beer. You know, according to touregypt.net, they say beer, which was called hakt by the ancients and zithus by the Greeks, was a very important Egyptian drink. This is fascinating to me. They said it was a drink for adults and children alike. It was the staple drink of the poor because wages were sometimes paid to Egyptians in beer. So that's probably, if we can't figure out exactly how they did it, we know what fueled the building of the pyramids. Those people were probably actually paid partially in beer. In fact, actually, I think the pyramid texts may even state as such, if memory serves. But they note that beer was more than that. It was a drink of the rich and the wealthy, and a drink offered to the gods and placed in the tombs of the dead. So even the pharaoh, as he made his way into the afterlife, took a little beer with him. So when it comes to the history of alcohol, I mean, the Egyptians knew all about the importance of beer. It played a fairly pivotal role in their society, in the sense that this was something that basically, no matter what your status was in society, it was a beverage that you enjoyed. And yes, as I had suspected, here according to touregypt.net, they note that workmen at the pyramids of the Giza Plateau were given beer thrice daily. There were 5 kinds of beer, 4 kinds of wine that were found by archaeologists who had been poking through dumps, examining skeletons, probing texts, and studying remains of beer jars and wine vats at Giza. Now this gets even more interesting, in fact, because apparently back in 1990, the Egyptian Exploration Society approached Scottish and Newcastle breweries for help. That's right, this was the beginning of a partnership which over the past few years has now considerably increased the understanding of the brewing process as it was at the time of Tutankhamun. Beer was depicted on the walls of the tombs, as were the scenes of ancient Egyptian breweries. It was possibly very similar to the way that beer is still produced today in locations like Sudan. But this is interesting to me because we often think about, Jerry and the buddies getting to drink a beer on Saturday night, right? I don't think that there's necessarily any kind of gender specificity when it comes to drinking beer. Go to any brewery in Asheville, North Carolina, and you'll see that people of all walks of life seem to enjoy drinking beer. And it's also very much become kind of a family thing. You see a lot of families going to breweries together here in Asheville. But in ancient Egypt, beer making was kind of a feminine thing because it was very closely related to the making of bread, and baking was also very much a role of women in that society. So rather than the men being the beer brewers, they may have been the beer drinkers, but the women were the master brewers in ancient Egypt. I find that fascinating.
Yeah, so obviously fascinating and, one of our favorite topics. And I can confirm, I think this is an age-old thing, and it's much like gold. Beer is a form of currency. I have personally worked for beer, and I have paid people in beer.
Yeah.
And, the world falls down around our ears. We still got beer. You still got money.
Indeed. Well, maybe this is something that you guys in the days ahead can bring up in this excellent conversation that we're all looking forward to with Bob Breyer. But again, a quick look back at ancient Egypt shows that the roots of alcohol go just as deep as any other history, and these are all aspects of history that we love to explore on every installment of this program. It is the 7 Ages audio journal, and so guys, with the history of alcohol now behind us, I think it is about time for us to pony up for one more round there at the Crosstime Pub. On behalf of Jason Pentrail, James Waldo, and yours truly, I am Micah Hanks, and we are the 7 Ages Research Associates. It's always our pleasure to bring you guys the very best in the history of humankind. That'll wrap it up for now. We will catch you guys again in the future, or perhaps in the past, on the next installment of the 7 Ages Audio Journal.